All right, it's 3 o'clock, and this is a fairly short program, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm Sarah Rosenkrantz. I'm the Exhibits and Education Assistant for the IU Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. And welcome everybody to today's Coffee and Curator event. We host these once a month, and it's going to be a 10-minute talk followed by a 10-minute Q&A. So please put questions in the chat during the talk or after, and I'll read them off to Caroline. And before we get rolling, I would like to acknowledge that IU Bloomington is on the ancestral homelands of the Miami, Shawnee, Potawatomi, and Delaware people. And all of these groups have thriving cultures that still influence the area today. And I encourage you, if you're in the area, to look into them. And if not, look into the Indigenous people in your area. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker for today. Caroline Goodwin is a graduate student pursuing a Master's of Music and Voice while also working in the ethnographic collections at the IU MA. Originally from Terre Haute, Indiana, Caroline has spent the last 6 years in Bloomington studying music, history, anthropology, and museum studies. Since January 2021, she has worked with the Ethnographic Collections Manager and Assistant Registrar, Emily Bryant, on inventorying, cataloging, and researching the D. Birnbaum collection and the museum's ethnographic collection as a whole. So welcome, Caroline.
Hi, everybody. It's great to be here today. I was so excited to get asked to do this talk. So I'm going to share my screen and we're going to get rolling because I have a lot of material I want to get through pretty quickly. So let's just get this going. Okay, how is that looking for everybody?
Looks good.
Okay. All right, so today I'm going to be talking about a specific portion of the D. Birnbaum collection. So I started working on this collection a little over 2 years ago now, which is at the time when I was doing this research. And I was just really struck by the beautiful red coral used in a lot of the jewelry in this collection. And I wanted to learn more about it. I was taking an environmental history class at the same time that I was doing this. So I decided to kind of take an interdisciplinary approach to studying this material and talking about its cultural implications as well as its environmental implications. So here we go. Let's get started. So first, I just want to say a note about Dee and her collection. Emily's giggling because she, I think, knows this picture of Dee. So Dee Birnbaum is currently an associate professor of business at Rhodes College in Memphis, Tennessee. And she has curated her collection through her travels to North Africa, the Middle East, Central Asia, and South Asia, mostly Turkey and Egypt. And she has collected and traveled nearly every year since the 1970s, and we now have over 2,300 artifacts that she donated. They're mostly clothing and jewelry, and we have over 1,000 pieces of jewelry, majority silver because that is preferred by Islamic communities. And I'm going to be talking about, like I said, a lot of this jewelry that features some beautiful red coral. So I wanted to show you guys a few pieces first. Starting with this one I just had on the opening slide. This is a Jewish-made Yemeni necklace. And you can see the red coral beads interwoven with the silver beads and silver pendants, really striking that red coral against the silver metal. This is one of my personal favorites, and you might recognize it from the promo picture. This is an Uzbeki pendant. As you can see, it has red coral in a couple of different shades, as well as various shades of turquoise. And those two pieces, those two materials are often used together because they have this really beautiful contrast. So yeah, we can come back to that later if anyone wants to read more about this piece specifically, but I just wanted to give you guys an idea of what red coral looks like. So this is a Moroccan necklace. This is a pretty simple piece, but it has a lot of red coral. It's just basically a string of red coral and silver beads. And this kind of thing would have been worn all around the Mediterranean. You see a lot of this kind of thing like in Italy as well. Really quite stunning. And this is not jewelry, but I always have to include it whenever I talk about the red coral in the D. Birnbaum collection. So this is actually an ottoman vest, and it has this beautiful gold wrapped thread. This was probably worn by a young woman or maybe also a boy. So the red coral that you see here is actually most likely imitation. It's not actually real red coral, though it looks very convincing. And I'm going to talk more about why these imitation red corals are so important later on. But this is one of my favorite pieces. I think it's just really cool. Okay, so now that you have an idea of what some of the jewelry looks like, I want to talk about why red coral was such a sought after material in a lot of different communities. As you can see, I just showed you pieces from lots of different cultures. And red coral is native to the Mediterranean. So any community that was on the Mediterranean or had contact with community on the Mediterranean was aware of red coral, and a lot of them used it in their jewelry. And this began in ancient times, and there are a lot of different beliefs that go along with red coral. So the ancient Greeks believed that red coral was formed from hardened droplets of blood from the severed head of Medusa, which I just think is so dramatic. I think that's great. In many regions, it's said to provide wisdom and prevent insanity. Among Berber women, especially in Morocco, they are a nomadic group, but there are a lot of them in Morocco, and they seek red coral for lots of different connotations, including healing, protection, prosperity, fertility, and good fortune. In Yemen and many other regions, it's said to ward off the evil eye, so it wards off jealousy and envy. And it can also symbolize blood and courage and strength. So it has a lot of really positive ideas associated with it. And that's part of the reason why it's in such high demand, along with the fact that it's just quite beautiful, I think, anyway. So now that you know a little bit about why it's used in jewelry, I want to kind of step into this interdisciplinary approach that I was talking about and talk a little bit about what coral actually is. So it surprises some people to learn that coral is actually the skeleton of an animal. It's not a stone, even though it's used in jewelry like a stone a lot of the time. Its scientific name is Corallium rubrum. And so what you see in jewelry is the skeleton of a colony of polyps on the Mediterranean seafloor. And you can see this picture of how they grow here, which I think is really cool. So there are some distinct features that red coral has because of the way that it grows. So where the polyps sit along the skeleton of the coral, this creates little depressions. And then there are little tubes that move food around the colony, and these create little grooves. So when you look at a piece of red coral, that it actually has a lot of imperfections. And that's one of the things that gives it character and makes it sought after. And that's how you can identify it as opposed to something that's imitation coral, because if it's imitation, it's probably more perfect than the real thing is. So it grows very slowly, which will be important later on. It grows less than a millimeter a year, and it reproduces very slowly. So this is an ancient, very slow-growing animal from the Mediterranean Sea. So how did we get the coral from the bottom of the Mediterranean onto these beautiful necklaces? Obviously, it had to be harvested in some way. In ancient times, the Greeks began very simply diving and using hooks attached to poles to basically pull the coral off of the ocean floor. But it often grows deeper than a diver can dive. So in the early 19th century, some new methods had to be devised, and this allowed coral harvesting in a commercial modern sense to begin. And Italy was really the capital of red coral harvesting in the Mediterranean. And you can see here a picture of one of the boats that would have been used to harvest coral. And the Italians employed an instrument called the ingenuo, which basically trawled the ocean floor. It was a wooden cross with nets attached to it that would trawl the ocean floor and pick up the coral. So you can imagine the kind of devastation that this would cause to the ocean floor, although it was very efficient in gathering coral. Um, Over time, this definitely depleted the red coral population, and in the 1950s, Italy ceased to export the good. And this was the beginning of a decline in red coral jewelry, and you don't see much new red coral jewelry being made today. Um, all right. So there are long-term implications of this overharvesting that occurred. Because it's so slow growing, it has still not recovered from the overharvesting in the 19th centuries. And this has been found in many studies in the 21st century. In 2010, a study found that even protected colonies, so even in like nature protection areas, um, coral had not achieved predicted growth. And in 2007 and 2009, CITES, which is the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, was petitioned to add red coral as an endangered species to their list. It was not and is still not recognized as endangered by CITES. So red coral is really in a precarious position in the Mediterranean, and it's very important to the Mediterranean environment. So I think this is something that the scientific community is going to continue to push for as we move forward into the 21st century. Um, so to wrap up here, I want to talk a little bit about sustainable practices. Um, Interestingly, a lot of the women who wore the red coral jewelry that I showed you before actually already had sustainable practices. And I have alluded to this with the imitation coral that I've showed you. So often, coral would be reused. If a piece of silver jewelry was to be melted down to be made into something new, the red coral would be saved and reused. But also, there were many materials that were used to look like red coral. So we have here red gypsum was often used, and these Kurdish earrings in this picture have beads that are actually glass, though they quite convincingly look like red coral beads, I think. And in the 20th and 21st centuries, plastic is an obvious choice, although it's more easily identified as false because it'll often have seams. And that's how we tend to identify it here at the museum. But it's really interesting that these women who wore these imitation beads seemed not to really have qualms about the fact that it wasn't authentic, because the color is really more important than the authenticity. The color is what carries all of the symbolic value that we were talking about earlier. And so the symbolic value is really more important to them than the monetary value. And Dee, when I interviewed her about this, was really intrigued by that mentality that she found in a lot of the women she met and bought from. So, what can we do? I just hope that this presentation today has showed that even our smallest belongings can sometimes have huge environmental impacts. And while no one individual is responsible for, the overharvesting of the Mediterranean or the many, kind of parallel environmental problems that we have, I think we all can learn to be more mindful, and we can benefit from this mentality that the women who wore this jewelry have, that substitutions can be just as good. Um, so I just hope that we've all learned a little bit today about what an interdisciplinary approach to, ethnographic collections could do to broaden our ideas about how we interact with the world. So thanks so much for tuning in. I know that was a lot of information pretty quickly. I'm happy to go back and answer questions. I also have a list of sources, so if you want to learn more, I could send you this list or send you the full paper. I wrote about this a couple years ago. But thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll now happily take any questions.
Yeah, thank you, Caroline. That was amazing. Great job. We do actually have one question already. It's what was one of the most interesting things you learned from this research?
Oh, that's a great question. I kind of started out just wanting to learn about coral as, its symbolic values, which I talked about a little bit. But learning about the environmental side of things was really unexpected. And so I found myself kind of diving deeper and deeper into those studies that I referenced, and just hearing about, how coral is being studied today and the impact that past harvesting is still having on the community of coral in the Mediterranean today was really unexpected and interesting to me.
Hey, and I had a question. You kind of mentioned, you touched on it a little bit, but how do you tell the difference between similar looking materials besides maybe just like one's more imperfect than the other?
Right. Sometimes it is really hard to tell. And there are some pieces that we have in the collection that we haven't been able to come to a definite conclusion about, and we wouldn't be unless we got the material tested to see what it actually is. But those imperfections are a big part of it, like I talked about. If you can look at it and see that it has little grooves and indentations, that's a pretty good indicator that it's real. If it's a very smooth surface, it looks too perfect, or if the color is maybe a little bit off. Once you've worked with the red coral, you get a good feel of the range of color that's typical for it. So you can kind of identify that way as well. But yeah, it just takes some time having to look at different pieces of red coral and figure out what makes one different from the other. Yeah.
And another question, are other types of coral found within the various collections at Ayuma?
Yeah, I haven't worked so much with other types of coral. Um, but yes, I would say definitely the white coral, you see that very often. And there are some other types of actually red colored coral that occur other places than the Mediterranean. But I really wanted to focus on this Corallium rubrum, which is like the specific species that we see in a lot of this jewelry.
And why did you hone in on red coral versus like the other materials found like on jewelry?
Also, a great question. Obviously, there's lots of beautiful materials you could talk about. The turquoise that I showed you in that piece is also, there's a really interesting history attached to that as well. But personally, I just didn't know much about red coral. And I just thought it was beautiful. And I thought, okay, why not delve a little bit deeper into that? It was really mostly just personal preference, honestly.
That's the best kind of research is personal preference.
Yeah.
Um, what is the most conventional shape of red coral in the Birnbaum jewelry? And do some retain the original coral form or are they all polished down and reshaped?
So we do have some pieces that have what you would call like branch coral. So it still looks kind of like the real thing. Most of the time it has been like polished a little bit to make it shine. But I would say the most common are those, is that like bead shape, kind of circular or cylindrical bead shape that's often strung or sometimes like inlaid in a piece. Yeah.
And Christine asked, would it be possible to get a copy of your bibliography and how would be the best way to do that?
Yes. Christine, could you put your email in the chat and then I will copy and paste it into my email so I can just send that to you? You can even DM it to me directly.
Or you could email myself. My email is on the IUMA website and I can forward it to Caroline too.
Yeah, we'll get it to you.
One more. Was there anything more about the harvesting that you thought was interesting?
Yeah, so I mean, there's an entire book that was written around the turn of the 20th century called Precious Stones by Max Bauer, and it has a whole section on coral harvesting that was written at the time of like the zenith of coral harvesting. So that was really interesting to read about. And Italy around that time was employing something like 2,000 boats and almost like 10,000 sailors or something insane, um, just harvesting coral in the Mediterranean. This is really a widespread practice, which is part of the reason why it was so devastating. Yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing. That's a huge number.
Yeah.
Well, are there any last questions before we wrap up? Doesn't look like it, so I'll go ahead and close us out. As I said, my email is on the website, and feel free to email me with any questions, and I'll make sure Caroline gets them, and we can put you into the correct contact with our collections managers if you're interested in studying this jewelry yourself. And as we close out, I did say at the top of the talk that this is like a recurring monthly program. And so our next one will be on April 13th, and Judy Kirk will be talking about the Ostrom collection. So thank you so much, Caroline. It was amazing. Good
Thank
job.
you. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in.